Before I begin, I need to say this clearly, and I need you to hear it the way I intend it. The names I will use tonight are not the real names. They were changed long before I ever encountered this account. They were changed to protect the living, to respect the dead, and to ensure that what matters most is not who they were, but what happened to them. The events, however, were not changed, not softened, not dramatized. What you are about to hear comes from hospital records, testimonies, and conversations that were never meant for public ears. Now listen carefully. This did not begin with a scream. It did not begin with violence. It did not even begin with fear. It began with silence. In the middle of a Kansas summer, in a psychiatric hospital that had already outlived its usefulness, there was a ward that nurses avoided, not because it was dangerous, but because it felt wrong. Anyone who has worked nights knows what I mean. Buildings speak when people stop talking. Pipes creak. Floors answer your steps. Even empty rooms hum with electricity and breath. But this place did not hum. There was a treatment room, identified only by a number, that went quiet in a way that defied routine explanation. Not a calm quiet, not the peaceful kind you find in a chapel after evening prayer. This was the kind of silence that presses against your ears, the kind that makes you suddenly aware of your own swallowing, your own breathing, your own heartbeat. A nurse on the night shift noticed it first. She had worked that ward for years. She knew the patterns. She knew which patients cried out in their sleep, which muttered prayers, which begged for someone who was not coming. She knew the sound of despair, because despair is rarely silent. But on that night, when she passed the door to that room, there was nothing. No call light, no restless movement, no whispering to unseen figures, nothing. She stopped walking because instinct told her something had changed. Nurses develop that instinct or they do not last. She checked the clock. She listened again. Minutes passed. The silence held. When morning came, the silence was still there. Inside the room, one patient was dead. He had not attacked anyone. He had not tried to escape. He had not fought. He had bitten through his own tongue. I want you to understand the physical reality of that act. This was not quick. This was not accidental. The human body resists that kind of damage with every reflex it has. Pain is designed to stop us. Survival is built into us. For a man to do this to himself, he must either be entirely disconnected from reality or entirely convinced that what he is doing is necessary. The walls told the rest of the story. Over and over again, carved with fingernails into paint and plaster, the same sentence appeared. Not shouted, not stylized, just repeated, as if repetition itself were the point. It is better not to speak. That was the first time anyone paid attention. The patient, whose name I will not use, was a former serviceman. He had survived things most people only encounter in nightmares. He had been evaluated by doctors, psychiatrists, counselors. His diagnosis explained his fear, his insomnia, his withdrawal. It did not explain this. He was not violent. He was not delusional in the traditional sense. He did not claim possession. He did not believe in demons. What he believed was simple. He believed that silence was safer. When asked why he avoided speaking, he did not say he was afraid of punishment. He did not say he feared judgment. He said something far more unsettling. He said that when everything was quiet, when there was no noise, no voices, no distractions, he could hear something clearly. Not loudly, not forcefully. Clearly, he said the voice did not tell him to hurt himself. It did not threaten him. It did not promise anything. It only advised gently, reasonably, like a thought that feels like your own until you realize it arrived fully formed. The voice told him that words make pain real, that speaking gives shape to suffering, that silence keeps wounds contained, and the more he obeyed, the calmer he felt. This is where most people make their first mistake. They assume that evil announces itself with chaos, that it shouts, that it breaks things, that it demands attention. In my experience, that is rarely true. What I have learned, both through formal training and pastoral encounters, is that the most dangerous influences are the ones that align themselves with our coping mechanisms. They do not introduce new behaviors, they deepen existing ones. They do not contradict trauma, they exploit it. This ward had a policy, a controversial one. Patients were discouraged from speaking unless necessary. Emotional expression was considered reinforcing. Silence was framed as therapeutic. The idea was that by removing verbal reinforcement, the mind would reorganize itself. On paper, it sounded clinical. In practice, it was starvation. Human beings do not heal in isolation. They do not process pain by suppressing it. When suffering has no language, it does not disappear. It turns inward, it condenses, it waits. The silence in that room did not empty it, it filled it. And whatever was filling it did not need belief, ritual, or invitation. It needed only what it was given freely, unspoken pain. By the time anyone questioned what was happening, the pattern had already begun to repeat. Other patients stopped speaking. Some wrote the same sentence again and again. Others avoided eye contact, avoided sound, avoided even prayer unless it could be done silently. When scripture was read aloud nearby, they reacted, not with fear, with insistence, finger to lips, heads turning in unison. Be quiet. That is where I will stop for now. Because once silence begins to defend itself, it is no longer absence. It has become something else entirely. I need to make something clear before we go further. What happened next did not unfold all at once. Evil rarely rushes. It prefers patterns, it prefers permission, and most of all, it prefers to remain unnamed. After the first death, administrators treated the incident as an isolated psychological break. Paperwork was filed, language was adjusted. Words like incident and complication replaced the word death. The ward stayed open. Routine continued, and silence was preserved, not questioned. That decision mattered, because silence, once protected, begins to change its character. Staff members started to notice it during handoff reports. Not the absence of sound, but the way sound behaved around that room. Voices dropped when they passed it. Conversations ended without anyone deciding to stop talking. Radios were turned down. Even laughter felt out of place, as if it violated an unspoken rule. No one gave that rule a name. The patients felt it first. They stopped asking questions. They stopped requesting medication. They stopped complaining about pain. On the surface, it looked like improvement. Charts reflected fewer incidents, less agitation, less resistance. Administrators praised the results. The method appeared to work. But the body always tells the truth before the mouth does. Patients began injuring themselves in quiet ways, fingernails torn back, lips bitten until they bled, throats scratched raw, none of it dramatic, none of it loud. The kind of damage that could be overlooked if you were not looking closely. And something else changed. When they did speak, briefly, reluctantly, they used the same phrasing, different voices, same words, same rhythm, not rehearsed, but shared. It is better not to speak. That sentence was not taught. It was not posted. It was not suggested. It emerged. That is when an older physician, long retired by the time I heard this account, requested access to archive files. He had seen something similar decades earlier, not identical, similar, enough to unsettle him. Buried in handwritten notes from the 1970s, there was a reference to a phenomenon that had never been officially classified. The notes did not call it a demon. They did not call it a hallucination. They called it an influence, a presence that grows where expression is denied. The name appeared only a few times, always crossed out, always written smaller than the rest of the text, as if the writer regretted committing it to paper. Murmur, not a proper name, a description. A sound beneath sound. The notes were careful. Whoever wrote them understood the danger of exaggeration. Murmur was not said to possess, not said to command. not set to create visions. It did not override free will. It persuaded, it thrived in repression, in secrets held too long, in shame never voiced, in grief that had no witness. It did not punish speech. It simply convinced the sufferer that speech was unsafe. That is the part people misunderstand. The patients were not being silenced by force. They were choosing silence because silence felt like relief. Think about that for a moment. Think about how many people you know who avoid speaking about the thing that hurts them most. Not because they are told to, but because it feels easier, cleaner, less risky. Murmur did not create that instinct. It attached itself to it. By the time a hospital chaplain took notice, the ward had changed in ways that no policy could explain. Prayer requests went unspoken. Confessions were avoided. Even silent prayer became rigid, mechanical, as if the act itself had been stripped of relationship. The chaplain did not begin with confrontation. He did not accuse. He did not name evil. He did what a good pastor does when something feels wrong. He listened, and what he heard was nothing. When he finally read scripture aloud in that room, not as a challenge, but as an offering, the reaction was immediate and coordinated. Heads turned, eyes fixed, fingers pressed to lips. It was not anger, it was correction. Be quiet. That was the moment silence revealed itself as something that could hear. And once silence listens, it can also respond. The chaplain did not perform an exorcism. He did not have authorization. He did not yet believe one was needed. But he understood that whatever was present did not fear holy words. It feared disruption. Because words break containment, that is where the danger truly lay. Not in screaming manifestations or violent outbursts, but in the quiet agreement between wounded minds and something that benefited from their restraint. When administrators were informed, they dismissed the concern as religious overreach. They cited progress metrics, reduced incidents, improved compliance. Silence was working. What they did not see was what silence was becoming. By the time formal intervention was considered, the ward no longer needed enforcement. Patients policed each other. Sound was discouraged socially. Expression was treated as contamination. Silence had become culture, and culture is far harder to exorcise than any spirit. That is where I will pause again, because the next step was not a ritual, it was a mistake, and it cost lives. What happened next did not begin with malice. That is important to understand. It began with confidence. The administration believed they were in control. They believed they were observing a clinical phenomenon, something unusual but manageable. They believed that if something had gone wrong, it could be corrected with procedure, with structure, with more discipline, so they formalized the silence. What had once been a loose therapeutic guideline became policy. Hours of restricted speech were extended, group sessions were shortened or eliminated. Patients were encouraged to write instead of speak, to internalize instead of express. Silence was no longer a side effect of treatment. It was the treatment. From a distance, the ward looked calmer than it had ever been. No shouting, no breakdowns, no confrontations. For administrators reviewing reports from offices miles away, it looked like success. Inside the ward, something else was happening. Patients stopped dreaming, or at least they stopped admitting that they did. Sleep became shallow, restless. People woke with clenched jaws and aching throats, as if they had been holding something back, even in unconsciousness. Nurses reported patients sitting upright for hours, eyes open, listening to nothing. But it was not nothing. Several patients described the same sensation independently when pressed gently by staff who still cared enough to ask. They said the silence felt thick, not empty, not peaceful. Thick, like standing underwater. Sound did not travel through it the way it should. And in that thickness, thought slowed. Speech felt dangerous, not because of punishment, but because of consequence. They could not articulate what that consequence was, only that once words entered the air, something shifted, something noticed. This is where I want you to pay attention. because this is the point where the line between psychological deterioration and spiritual intrusion becomes difficult to separate. That difficulty is not a flaw. It is the doorway. The human mind, under prolonged suppression, will seek patterns. It will personify pressure. It will assign intention to discomfort. That does not mean intention is not present. It means discernment must be careful. In this case, discernment was absent. A senior physician raised concerns. He documented the self-harm, the identical phrasing, the synchronized behaviors. He warned that something systemic was occurring. His reports were acknowledged and filed, then ignored, because silence produces compliance, and compliance looks like healing to those who measure success by order rather than wholeness. As the weeks passed, the ward no longer required monitoring for noise. Patients enforced the quiet themselves. When a new patient cried out during the night, others reacted with agitation, not sympathy. They hissed, they gestured, they stared until the sound stopped. Not violently, effectively, the phrase appeared again, this time written on scraps of paper, on bathroom mirrors, on the backs of institutional clipboards. It is better not to speak. Always the same wording, always the same structure, no variations, no elaboration. That uniformity matters. True mental illness fractures language. It fragments expression. It introduces chaos. What was happening here did the opposite. It compressed language, reduced it, distilled it into a single directive. That is not how trauma speaks. That is how something else speaks through trauma. The chaplain returned to the ward more frequently. He did not preach. He did not confront administrators directly. He simply spent time there, sitting, breathing, occasionally reading aloud in a calm, measured voice. Each time he did, the response intensified. Patients covered their ears. Some rocked, others trembled. One patient stood abruptly and struck his head against the wall, repeatedly, without sound, until he was restrained. Afterward, when asked why, he wrote only one sentence. Too loud. That word stayed with the chaplain. Not wrong, not dangerous, too loud. The chaplain requested permission for a formal spiritual evaluation. He did not use the word exorcism. He asked only for assessment. The request was delayed. Committees were formed. Legal concerns were raised. During that delay, the first staff injury occurred. A nurse, exhausted and frustrated, attempted to coax a patient into speaking during a routine check. She raised her voice, not shouted, just louder than the ward had become accustomed to. The patient lunged, not at her throat, not at her face, at his own jaw. He slammed his head forward, hard enough to fracture bone. Blood filled his mouth. Still, he made no sound. When the nurse screamed, the ward reacted, not with panic, with hostility. That was the moment administrators could no longer deny that something had inverted. The silence was no longer calming aggression. It was directing it. The decision was finally made to intervene. But the intervention they chose was the wrong one. They decided to confront the silence head on. They planned a ritual, though they did not call it that, a coordinated effort to restore speech, to flood the ward with sound, to force expression back into place. They believed that if silence had become the problem, noise would be the solution. They did not understand what they were challenging, because murmur, if that name is even appropriate, was never silence itself. It was what grew inside it. And when you break a container without understanding what it holds, you do not free what is trapped. You release it. That night, voices were raised, lights were brightened, patients were instructed, encouraged, then ordered to speak. Staff read aloud, prayed aloud, called names. The reaction was immediate and catastrophic. Patients collapsed. Some screamed, others convulsed. One slipped into a state from which he never returned. A nurse, trying to restrain a thrashing patient, was struck and fell, her jaw shattered against the floor. And somewhere in the chaos, the man who had built the silence, who had defended it, who had insisted it was healing, disappeared. They found him later. In the room where it all began, no note, no explanation, just words written on the glass, smeared and uneven, as if written in haste or regret. You should have let them speak. That was not a threat. It was an accusation, and it did not come from the dead man. We will go further next time. Because what remained after that night was not peace. It was residue, and residue has a way of traveling. After that night, the ward never returned to normal. They will tell you it did. The reports say procedures were revised. The memos say protocols were updated. The charts say patients were transferred or discharged. But normal is not something you can restore with paperwork. Normal is a sense, and that sense was gone. The room was sealed first. Not immediately demolished, not yet. Sealed, locked. As if walls and a door could hold back what had already proven it did not need a body, a voice, or a name. Staff avoided the corridor. Those who had been present that night asked to be reassigned. Some resigned. Others stayed but changed, quieter, more guarded, as if they were afraid of carrying sound with them. One nurse, months later, described it this way. She said that after that night, silence followed her home. Not the absence of noise, but the feeling that something was listening when the television was off, when the house settled, when her own thoughts slowed. She began sleeping with the radio on. Another staff member developed a stutter. No neurological cause, no prior history. He said words felt heavy, like lifting something that resisted being moved. These were not patients. These were trained professionals. The official investigation concluded that the events were the result of compounded trauma, administrative failure, and misapplied therapeutic methods. No external influence was acknowledged. No spiritual explanation entertained. And yet, the hospital closed within a few years. Not because of public outrage, not because of scandal, because people stopped wanting to work there. The room was eventually destroyed, brick by brick, floor pulled up, walls broken down. Nothing unusual was found. No symbols, no artifacts, no physical trace of what had happened there. That, too, is important, because whatever had been present was never anchored to the structure. It was anchored to the condition, silence enforced, expression denied, pain contained. After the closure, similar cases began appearing elsewhere. Not identical, never identical. Evil adapts to context, but familiar enough that those who knew the old reports felt a chill when they read them. Patients who refused to speak, not out of fear, but conviction. Patients who wrote the same phrase repeatedly. Patients who reacted to spoken prayer with agitation, not blasphemy, but correction. Be quiet. Administrators dismissed connections. Coincidence is comforting. Patterns are not. I encountered this account years later, not as a headline, not as a case study, but as a footnote in a conversation between two men who had seen too much to believe in clean explanations. One of them said something that has stayed with me ever since. He said, "We thought silence was neutral. We learned too late that it never is. Silence can be prayer. Silence can be reverence. Silence can be healing. But silence imposed, silence enforced, silence weaponized against truth becomes something else entirely." In deliverance ministry, people often ask me what demons want: power, control, destruction. Those are outcomes. What they want first is agreement. Murmur, if we continue to use that word, never demanded worship, never demanded belief. It did not need grand gestures or rituals. It needed people to agree that speaking was dangerous. That truth was optional. That pain was better hidden than healed. Once that agreement was in place, everything else followed naturally. The tragedy of that room was not that something evil entered it. It was that something wounded invited it without ever realizing an invitation had been extended. When the chaplain involved was later asked if he believed the presence was gone, he answered honestly. He said, "I believe the room is empty. I do not believe the problem was the room." That is the lesson I leave you with tonight. Evil does not always arrive with violence. Sometimes it arrives with relief, with quiet, with the promise that if you just stop speaking, the pain will finally rest. But pain does not rest when it is silenced. It waits, and whatever waits with it listens very carefully. That concludes this part. Because the most dangerous hauntings are not tied to buildings, they are carried by people who were never allowed to speak. I want to be very careful with what I say next, because this is the point where stories like this are often dismissed, where people say this is where it becomes exaggerated or symbolic or shaped by memory. I understand that instinct. I share it. Discernment demands restraint, but restraint does not mean denial. After the hospital closed, there was an assumption that whatever had gone wrong was contained by distance and time. The building was gone, the ward dismantled, the room erased. People moved on. That assumption was wrong. What followed did not look like a haunting. There were no apparitions, no cold spots, no sudden violence, nothing that would attract attention. What followed looked like therapy. In other facilities, in other states, clinicians began noticing a particular kind of resistance. Patients who were articulate on intake forms but withdrawn in sessions. Patients who nodded, complied, followed instructions perfectly, yet refused to verbalize anything meaningful. They did not say they could not speak. They said they should not. That distinction matters. Some of them used identical language, though they had never met. Others expressed the same idea in different words, but with the same underlying logic. Speaking made things worse. Silence made things manageable. They were not psychotic. They were not dissociative in the usual sense. They were calm, cooperative, polite, too polite. One therapist described it as working with people who had already made peace with their pain, but not in a healthy way. They had negotiated with it, set terms. Silence was the price. When prayer was introduced, reactions varied. Silent prayer was tolerated, sometimes even welcomed. Spoken prayer, however, caused distress, not fear, irritation. Like an unnecessary disturbance, words disrupt. That phrase appeared again. Not written on walls this time, written in journals, in margins, on intake paperwork where it did not belong. Do not disturb. I was told about one case by a colleague who did not believe in deliverance ministry. He believed in neuroscience, in trauma-informed care, in evidence-based practice. He told me this because he could not explain it. A patient had been mute by choice for months, not catatonic, not aphasic, simply unwilling to speak. When asked why, he wrote that speech made things louder inside. During a routine evaluation, a nurse accidentally dropped a metal tray. The sound was sharp, sudden. The patient reacted immediately. He covered his ears and whispered out loud without realizing it. Too much. It was the first word he had spoken in months. When the nurse asked him what he meant, he went silent again. Later, when encouraged to explain in writing, he wrote a single sentence: "If I speak, it hears me." Now, listen to me carefully. I am not saying that every instance of selective mutism is spiritual. I am not saying trauma cannot explain withdrawal. It often does. We must never leap to conclusions where patience is required, but there is a difference between inability and avoidance, and there is a difference between fear and allegiance. In the cases that troubled me most, silence was not defensive, it was protective. Not protecting the person, protecting something else. This is where my own experience matters, not as proof, but as context. In my work, I have encountered presences that do not manifest as aggression. They do not seek spectacle. They seek consent. They operate within the bounds of a person's reasoning, nudging choices rather than overriding them. They sound like thoughts. They feel like conclusions you arrived at on your own. And they thrive where suffering is isolated. Murmur, if that name still serves us, does not attach to geography. It does not linger in ruins. It does not need dark rituals or belief systems. It attaches to people who have learned that speaking costs too much. That is why destroying the room did nothing. The room was never the source. It was a container, a catalyst, a place where the conditions were perfected. Once those conditions exist elsewhere, the pattern can repeat, not dramatically, quietly. I have been asked many times why the church does not speak more often about these kinds of cases, why there are no formal declarations, no public warnings. The answer is simple: because you cannot warn people about silence without first teaching them how to speak. And speaking is risky. It opens wounds. It invites judgment. It forces memory into the open. Silence feels safer until it is not. What I want you to take from this part is not fear. It is responsibility. If you are listening to this and thinking of the things you never say, the truths you keep buried, the pain you have learned to manage by avoiding language, understand this: silence can be a refuge, but it should never be a prison. And anything that tells you that your voice is dangerous, that your truth must remain hidden, that speaking will make things worse for everyone involved, should be examined very carefully, because the most effective lies are the ones that feel like self-protection. We will go further, because there is one final misunderstanding that must be corrected. Murmur was never defeated. It was interrupted. And interruption is not the same thing as deliverance. That is where this story truly ends. There is a mistake people make when they hear stories like this. They assume there was a moment when everything ended, a final prayer, a final confrontation, a closing door. They want a clean line between before and after. That line does not exist. What happened in that hospital did not conclude with a victory or a defeat. It concluded with confusion. And confusion is fertile ground. After the deaths, after the injuries, after the closure, there was a collective desire to explain the events in ways that did not require further responsibility. Administrative failure, outdated practices, poor oversight, all of those were true, but they were not sufficient. The deeper error was this: everyone involved believed that the problem had been an intrusion, something foreign, something external. So the solution they looked for was removal. That assumption shaped every response that followed. When the chaplain was later interviewed, he admitted something that never made it into any official report. He said that when he read aloud in that room and felt the resistance rise, he believed he was provoking a presence. He was wrong. He was revealing a dependency. The patients were not being oppressed by something separate from them. They were participating in something that had woven itself into their coping strategies, their beliefs about safety, their understanding of pain. That is why the intervention failed. They tried to cast out what had never fully moved in. Deliverance requires a rejection, not of suffering, but of the lie attached to it. No one ever rejected the lie because no one ever named it. The lie was simple: that silence keeps you safe. That lie survived the hospital. It survived the investigations. It survived the demolition because it was never challenged where it lived, inside people. Years later, when I encountered these accounts, I did not approach them as cases of possession. I approached them as warnings, patterns, signals. In true possession, the will is assaulted. In cases like this, the will is persuaded, and persuasion is harder to undo. You cannot command someone to stop believing what has kept them functioning. You cannot rip away silence from someone who has survived because of it. You must offer something stronger. Truth spoken carefully, and truth takes time. That is why no formal exorcism was ever performed in the aftermath. Not because it was unnecessary, but because it would have been irresponsible. There was no single subject. There was no singular manifestation. There was only a widespread agreement with a false premise. You cannot expel an agreement. You must dissolve it. I want to say something here that may unsettle you. Most people who live under the influence I am describing will never experience anything supernatural in the way they expect. No voices, no shadows, no dramatic events. They will simply feel that speaking is unwise. They will feel that their pain is a burden. They will feel that silence is maturity, and they will pass that belief on. subtly, to others. Children learn it. Communities normalize it. Institutions reward it. That is how murmur survives. Not as a being lurking in darkness, but as a habit reinforced by fear. In one final note attached to the old hospital files, written by someone whose name I never learned, there was a sentence that explained more than all the reports combined. It read, "We mistook calm for healing." That mistake is everywhere. We praise composure over honesty. We value quiet compliance over difficult truth. We call restraint virtue even when it destroys the person practicing it. This is not a demon's invention. It is an opportunity a demon recognizes. When silence becomes more important than truth, something always fills the space truth leaves behind. That is not theology. That is observation. If you are waiting for a final ritual in this story, there is none. If you are waiting for a triumphant ending, you will be disappointed. What remains is a responsibility that does not end when the story does. To speak when silence is demanded, to listen when speech is fragile, to recognize the difference between peace and suppression, because the greatest danger is not that something evil will speak to you. It is that something evil will convince you not to speak at all. There is one part left, and it is the most uncomfortable part, because it has nothing to do with that hospital. It has to do with us, and if you have stayed with me this long, then you deserve honesty without distance. What I'm about to say is not an accusation. It is an invitation to examine something most people would rather leave undisturbed. Because the last truth in this story is not about a hospital, a policy, or even a presence. It is about choice. Long after the events I have described, I was asked a question during a quiet conversation, not a public talk, not an interview. A simple question asked by someone who had been listening very carefully. They asked me whether I believed murmur still existed. I did not answer immediately, because existence is the wrong category. Murmur is not something you hunt. It is something you allow. It survives wherever silence is treated as virtue rather than necessity, wherever pain is managed instead of addressed, wherever people are praised for enduring quietly instead of being helped to heal honestly. And that includes places far more familiar than psychiatric wards: churches, families, workplaces, communities. Anywhere a person learns that speaking costs too much, something waits to benefit. I have sat with people who were never abused physically, never diagnosed, never hospitalized, yet lived under the same internal rule that governed that room. Do not speak, do not disturb, do not make it worse. They were admired for their strength, for their composure, for their restraint. No one noticed that their restraint was killing them slowly, and no one noticed because it was quiet. This is the most dangerous misunderstanding of all, that evil must be loud, that if something were truly wrong, it would announce itself clearly, dramatically, unmistakably. In reality, the most corrosive influences sound reasonable. They use our own language. They borrow our logic. They hide inside our survival strategies. Silence kept you safe once. That does not mean it will keep you whole forever. There is a moment in every life when the thing that protected you begins to imprison you. That moment does not arrive with alarms. It arrives with relief. Relief that you no longer have to explain yourself. Relief that you no longer have to relive the memory. Relief that you can function without being seen. And if you are not careful, that relief becomes allegiance. You do not have to believe in demons for this to matter. You only have to believe that truth matters more than comfort. When I speak about deliverance, people imagine confrontation, authority, command. In cases like this, deliverance looks like courage. The courage to name what hurts. The courage to risk being misunderstood. The courage to let words exist in the open. Because words do something silence cannot. They invite relationship, and whatever thrives in isolation cannot survive relationship. That is why the presence in that hospital reacted to spoken scripture, not because the words were magical, but because they were relational. They named truth aloud. They broke containment. That is why the phrase was always the same. It is better not to speak. not because speech was sinful, because speech was dangerous to the lie. I will tell you this plainly. If you are listening to this and you recognize yourself in any part of this story, do not rush to conclusions. Do not assume something supernatural is at work, but do not dismiss the warning either. Ask yourself one question, honestly. What am I afraid will happen if I speak? If the answer is discomfort, that is human. If the answer is rejection, that is painful. If the answer is that something inside you resists being named, resists being exposed, resists being brought into the light of another person's understanding, then pay attention. Because healing always begins with sound, a cry, a confession, a prayer spoken out loud, a truth finally said. Silence has its place, but silence that replaces truth is never neutral. The hospital is gone, the room is gone, the files are sealed, but the lesson remains. Do not mistake quiet for peace. Do not mistake endurance for healing. Do not mistake silence for safety. And never believe the voice that tells you that your pain is best kept hidden. Because the moment you accept that voice, something else is already listening. This story ends here, but what you do with your voice does not. And that choice belongs to you.